Welcome to our video about the Caylee Anthony trial, one of the most captivating and controversial trials in recent history. In 2011, Caylee Anthony was acquitted of murdering her 2-year-old daughter Caylee, and the trial sparked intense debate and speculation across the nation. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos on true crime and other fascinating topics. Let's get started. Chapter 1: A Perfect Life. Caylee Anthony had it all. She was a young mother with a beautiful daughter, Caylee, whom she loved more than anything in the world. She had a supportive family and a circle of friends who adored her. Caylee lived in a small house in a quiet suburb of Orlando, Florida, where she spent her days taking care of Caylee and working as a part-time event planner. One afternoon, Caylee's mother, Cindy, came over to her house to drop off some groceries. As she walked through the door, she was struck by how clean and organized the house was. The living room was spotless, and Caylee's toys were neatly arranged in a corner. Caylee was dressed in a cute sundress and had her hair tied back in a ponytail. She looked happy and relaxed, like everything in her life was perfect. Cindy smiled at her daughter and hugged her tightly. "You're doing such a great job, sweetie," she said. "I'm so proud of you." Caylee beamed with pride. "Thanks, Mom. I'm just trying to be the best mom I can be." Caylee ran into the room, giggling and holding a stuffed animal. "Grandma," she exclaimed, running into Cindy's arms. Cindy scooped up the little girl and twirled her around. "How's my little angel doing today?" she asked, planting a kiss on Caylee's cheek. Caylee watched them with a smile on her face, feeling grateful for her wonderful family. She couldn't imagine her life without them. Chapter 2: A Mother's Stress. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Caylee's life seemed to be going perfectly, but underneath the surface, she was struggling. The pressures of being a single mother and providing for her daughter were starting to take a toll on her. She had started to neglect herself and her home, and her once perfect life began to crumble. One day, Cindy came over to Caylee's house and found her sitting on the couch, surrounded by dirty dishes and empty takeout containers. Her hair was unkempt, and she looked tired and worn out. "What's going on, Caylee?" Cindy asked, concern etched on her face. Caylee shrugged her shoulders. "I don't know, Mom. I'm just so tired all the time. Caylee's been keeping me up at night, and work has been really stressful lately." Cindy put a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You need to take care of yourself, Caylee. You can't take care of Caylee if you're not taking care of yourself first." Caylee nodded, realizing her mother was right. She needed to make some changes in her life. Over the next few weeks, Caylee started to focus on self-care. She went to the gym, started eating healthier, and made sure to take breaks when she needed them. Slowly but surely, she started to feel like herself again. Chapter 3: A Tragic Accident. Despite Caylee's efforts to improve her life, tragedy struck in the most unexpected way. One day, Caylee woke up to find that Caylee was nowhere to be found. She searched the house and the surrounding area, but her daughter was nowhere to be found. Panic set in, and Caylee's mind raced. Where could her daughter be? Had someone taken her? Was she lost in the woods behind their house? As the hours turned into days, the search for Caylee intensified. The police were called, and volunteers from the community joined in the search efforts. Casey's family and friends rallied around her, offering their support and prayers. But despite the search efforts, Caylee was nowhere to be found. One evening, Casey received a call from her brother, Lee. "Casey, we found something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What? What did you find?" Casey asked, her heart racing. Lee hesitated for a moment before saying, "Caylee's body. We found Caylee's body." Casey's world came crashing down around her. She couldn't believe it. Her beautiful, sweet daughter was gone forever. In a state of shock and desperation, Casey made a decision that would change her life forever. She decided to hide Caylee's body and lie about what had happened. Chapter 4: The Search. The news of Caylee's death hit the community hard, and the search for answers began. The police immediately launched an investigation into her death, and Casey's family and friends were questioned. Despite their best efforts, the police were unable to find any evidence to support Casey's story. Her behavior during the search for Caylee raised suspicion, and she seemed more concerned with her own well-being than finding her daughter. As the days turned into weeks, the search for Caylee continued. Flyers with her picture were posted all over town, and volunteers combed the woods and fields near Casey's house. The media covered the story extensively, and people all over the country followed the case with bated breath. Casey's family stood by her side, but the community started to turn against her. Protesters gathered outside her home, shouting insults and demanding justice for Caylee. Casey became the face of evil, a mother who had killed her own child and then tried to cover it up. But despite the pressure, Casey refused to confess to anything. She stuck to her story, insisting that Caylee had been kidnapped and that she had no idea what had happened to her. Chapter 5: Suspicions Arise. As the investigation into Caylee's death continued, suspicions about Casey's involvement in the crime began to grow. Her behavior during the search for Caylee was strange and erratic, and she seemed more concerned with partying and having fun than finding her daughter. The media coverage of the case intensified, and rumors and speculation spread like wildfire. People accused Casey of everything from drug use to murder, and her reputation was in tatters. Meanwhile, the police continued to question Casey and her family, looking for any clues that might help them solve the case. But despite their best efforts, they were unable to find any evidence to support Casey's story. As the months went by, Casey's situation grew increasingly desperate. She was under constant scrutiny, and the pressure was taking its toll. She began to feel like everyone was against her, and she couldn't trust anyone. But in the midst of all the chaos, Casey held on to one hope: that she would be able to clear her name and prove her innocence. Chapter 6: The Interrogation. The police's suspicions about Casey's involvement in Caylee's death finally came to a head when they brought her in for questioning. They had evidence that contradicted her story, and they wanted to hear her side of the story. Casey's demeanor during the interrogation was cold and detached. She seemed almost bored by the whole process, as if she knew that nothing they said could touch her. But as the hours wore on, cracks began to appear in her facade. The police pressed her relentlessly, pointing out inconsistencies in her story and questioning her every move. Caylee grew increasingly agitated and defensive, insisting that she had nothing to do with Caylee's death. But as the interrogation went on, Caylee's lies started to unravel. She contradicted herself repeatedly, and the police had enough evidence to arrest her on charges of murder. Caylee's world crumbled around her as she was taken into custody. She had always believed that she would be able to talk her way out of any situation, but this time, the truth had caught up with her. Chapter 7: The Trial Begins. The trial of Caylee Anthony began with intense media scrutiny and public interest. The prosecution presented their case, arguing that Caylee had murdered her daughter to escape the responsibility of being a mother. The defense, meanwhile, argued that Caylee's death was an accidental drowning and that Caylee had panicked and covered it up. They presented a series of experts to support this theory and tried to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. As the trial progressed, the testimony of witnesses painted a disturbing picture of Caylee's behavior in the weeks following Caylee's disappearance. She had lied repeatedly to friends and family, and had gone out partying and drinking as if nothing had happened. The prosecution argued that this behavior showed Caylee's callousness and lack of concern for her daughter's welfare. The defense countered that Caylee was simply trying to cope with the trauma of losing her child. The trial was emotionally charged and difficult for everyone involved. But in the end, it was up to the jurors to decide whether Caylee was guilty of murder or not. Chapter 8: The Defense. The defense continued to present their case in court, arguing that Caylee's death was a tragic accident that Caylee had panicked and covered up. They called experts to testify that the evidence found at the scene was consistent with an accidental drowning. The defense also pointed to Caylee's troubled upbringing, arguing that she had learned to cope with stress and trauma by burying her emotions and keeping secrets. They suggested that this behavior explained why Caylee had lied about Caylee's whereabouts and had failed to report her missing for over a month. The defense's arguments were compelling, and many people watching the trial began to wonder whether Caylee was really guilty of murder. But the prosecution had evidence that was difficult to refute, including the fact that Caylee had conducted internet searches for terms like chloroform and how to make chloroform before Caylee's disappearance. As the trial continued, the tension in the courtroom grew more and more intense. Everyone was waiting to hear what the jurors would decide. Chapter 9: The Prosecution. The prosecution presented their case in court, arguing that Caylee had murdered her daughter to escape the responsibilities of motherhood. They pointed to the fact that Caylee had lied repeatedly to friends and family about Caylee's whereabouts and had gone out partying and drinking while her daughter was missing. The prosecution also argued that Caylee's internet searches for chloroform and related topics were evidence of premeditation. They presented forensic evidence that suggested that Caylee had been suffocated, rather than drowning. As the trial went on, the prosecution continued to call witnesses who testified to Caylee's strange behavior and lack of concern for her daughter's welfare. They also presented evidence that Caylee had stolen money from her family and had lied to her employer about having a sick child in order to take time off work. The prosecution's case was strong, but the defense continued to argue that Caylee's death was an accident and that Caylee had covered it up out of fear and panic. As the trial entered its final phase, it was clear that the jury would have a difficult decision to make. Chapter 10: The Verdict. After weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury finally began their deliberations. The whole nation was holding their breath, waiting to hear what the verdict would be. As the jury deliberated, tension mounted outside the courthouse. Crowds of people gathered, holding signs and chanting slogans. News cameras broadcast live from the scene, capturing every moment of the trial's dramatic conclusion. Finally, after several days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed as the judge read out the jury's decision. The verdict was a shock to many: not guilty of first-degree murder, aggravated manslaughter, or aggravated child abuse. Caylee was only found guilty of 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement. The decision sparked outrage and disbelief among many who had been following the case. How could Caylee be found not guilty of murder when so much evidence seemed to point to her guilt? The aftermath of the verdict was tumultuous, with protests, media debates, and public outcry. For many, the case had become a symbol of the justice system's failures, and questions about Caylee's guilt or innocence lingered on. Chapter 11: The Aftermath. After the verdict was announced, the media frenzy surrounding the case showed no signs of slowing down. News outlets continued to report on every detail of Caylee's life, and tabloids published sensationalized stories about the trial and its aftermath. Caylee's family also struggled to deal with the fallout from the trial. Her parents, George and Cindy, had become estranged from their daughter during the trial, and tensions between them remained high. Caylee herself remained largely out of the public eye in the months after the trial. She faced numerous legal and financial issues, including lawsuits and mounting debts. Meanwhile, rumors and speculation about the case continued to swirl. Some people believed that Caylee was truly innocent and had been wrongly accused, while others were convinced of her guilt and believed that justice had not been served. As time went on, the intense public scrutiny of the case gradually faded away. But for those who had been personally affected by the tragedy, the scars remained. Chapter 12: The Truth Comes Out. Years after the trial had ended, a bombshell revelation shook the nation. Caylee had been secretly recording conversations with a private investigator she had hired during the trial, and in one of those conversations, she had admitted that her daughter Caylee had drowned accidentally in the family pool. The recording was leaked to the media, and the news of Caylee's confession quickly spread. People were stunned and outraged that Caylee had been able to walk free despite her apparent guilt. The revelation also caused a rift in Caylee's family. Her parents, George and Cindy, were devastated by the news and felt betrayed by their daughter's lies. Caylee herself remained largely silent in the wake of the new evidence. Her lawyer released a statement denying the authenticity of the recording, but few people believed him. The truth about Caylee's death had finally come out, but for many, it was too little, too late. The wounds left by the tragedy would never fully heal. Chapter 13: The Consequences. In the wake of the recording's release, Caylee's life continued to unravel. She faced numerous lawsuits and legal challenges, and her financial situation became increasingly dire. Meanwhile, her relationship with her family remained strained. Her parents continued to speak out against her, and her brother Lee filed a lawsuit against her for defamation. Despite all this, Caylee refused to speak publicly about the new evidence that had come to light. She continued to maintain her innocence and insisted that Caylee's death had been an accident. As time went on, Caylee's situation only grew more desperate. She struggled to find work and support herself financially, and her reputation was permanently tarnished by the scandal. In the end, the consequences of her actions had caught up with her, and she was forced to face the harsh reality of her choices. Chapter 14: Redemption. Despite all the negative attention and legal troubles that plagued her, Caylee remained determined to turn her life around. She enrolled in college and began studying law, hoping to use her own experiences to help others who had faced similar struggles. As she worked to rebuild her life, she also reached out to her family and tried to mend the broken relationships that had been shattered by the trial. Over time, her parents began to soften towards her, and they eventually reconciled. As Caylee's legal career began to take off, she also became involved in various charities and organizations that focused on helping families in need. She used her own experiences to connect with others and offer support and guidance. Despite the public's continued skepticism and mistrust, Caylee continued to work towards redemption and making amends for her mistakes. She knew that she could never fully make up for what had happened to Caylee, but she remained committed to doing everything in her power to help others and make a positive impact in the world. Chapter 15: The End. Years passed, and Caylee's life continued to evolve. She became a successful lawyer and advocate for families in need, and she used her platform to speak out about the importance of mental health and seeking help when struggling with difficult emotions. Despite the progress she had made, however, the shadow of the trial and her daughter's death continued to loom over her. She knew that she would always be associated with one of the most infamous cases in American history, and that her name would always be associated with Caylee's tragic death. In the end, though, Caylee found peace in knowing that she had done everything she could to make amends and live a life that would make Caylee proud. She knew that she would always carry the weight of her past with her, but she was determined to use it as a source of strength and motivation to continue making a positive impact in the world. And so, as the years continued to pass, Caylee Anthony became a symbol of resilience and redemption, proof that even in the face of unimaginable tragedy and adversity, it is always possible to find hope and create a better future.